They told her she had 3 months to live. The words landed like a verdict in a house that had stopped believing in ordinary time. Balloons from a hastily arranged 6th birthday party sagged against a high ceiling. A slice of cake waited on a plate as if suspended in an act of faith. On a mantelpiece, a faded photograph of Laura's mother smiled back at the room, an image as steady and small as a lighthouse in a sea of monitors and medicine. In the nursery, a stuffed bear still wore the ribbon from last year's present. The diagnosis made those small things unbearably loud. Sebastião moved through the rooms like a man practiced in making problems disappear. He had the look of someone used to having doors open for him. Expensive tailoring, quiet, decisive steps. He had money enough to charter private jets and assemble teams. He had access to the best oncologists the country could offer. But none of that softened the sharpness of sleepless nights, the hollow where his wife used to be, the way his daughter's small body now mapped a new geography of fear over his life. Carmen had been in that house for 3 years before the diagnosis hardened into a timetable. She knew the creaks in the floors better than most, the way the light tilted across the dining table at 9 in the morning. She had been hired as a nanny, at first to provide a steady hand for a restless child and a grief-flooded father. But she grew into something the contracts could never write down. She braided Laura's hair on lazy Sunday afternoons, read the same picture book until she knew every cadence. And she stood at that child's bedside for nights when fever made sleep a stranger. There is a kind of intimacy that arrives from ordinary obligations kept in the face of small cruelties. A diaper changed over and over, a temperature checked at 3 a.m., a story read with a trembling voice. Carmen's devotion had the steadiness of habit and the sharpness of choice. She had not been born into privilege. Her story began elsewhere, on the other side of a city where hospitals were more myth than promise. When she was a girl, Carmen had lost her sister to an illness that should have been treated. The clinic closed its doors, the medicines were out of reach. Carmen still remembered the wet, useless feeling of helplessness, the way poverty had tipped the scales. That memory sat in her like a stone. It made her particular about certain vows. When Laura's small hand found hers one night and said, "Mama, will I live?" Carmen felt something in her chest go loud and raw. The old fear and a new promise, formed not with words but with a resolve that tightened like a knot. She could not know then what sacrifices the knot would demand. She could only answer, holding the child close, "We will fight." Sebastião fought in his own way. He signed forms, arranged consultations, paid specialists who spoke in clinical optimisms and guarded disclaimers. He flew Laura to centers of excellence. He authorized experimental approaches when there were honest options to try. He read the scans and listened to the men and women in white coats explain probabilities and palliative routes. He had everything the world could label as resources, and yet the finality in those doctors' eyes was a language he did not control. "This is aggressive," one oncologist said at a meeting around a glass table. He spoke quietly, the way clinicians do when they try to keep grief at a measurable distance. "We have exhausted standard chemotherapy. We can attempt further targeted therapies, and we will, but you should understand the prognosis. Statistically speaking, we must prepare for limited time." 3 months. Phrases like that turn calendars into instruments of dread. For a man who had always bought time, who had bargained with schedules and favored specialists, the number sank its teeth into him. He hired a private nurse at once. He converted rooms into treatment spaces. He kept the house hovering between hospital calm and domestic normalcy. But there are some calculations money cannot reframe into comfort. Laura took all of this in the way children do, with a sweetness that can make the cruelest things feel less like judgment and more like puzzle pieces. She insisted on a birthday party. Not the elaborate affair one might expect in a home of such means. She wanted balloons, the empowerment of blowing out candles, a cake with blue icing, and a single plastic figure on top. Her requests were small, lucid, the kind of things that sound like prayers because they are almost absurdly normal. Carmen watched the child measure her days, marking them on a calendar with stickers, choosing which toy to bring to bed. There were mornings when Laura would run to the window and count the number of taxis on the street as if she were measuring luck. Those mornings, Carmen made coffee and kept her jaw steady. She wrapped the child in blankets and told stories of stubborn animals who never gave up despite everything the world told them. In private, Carmen started reading beyond storybooks. The hospital corridors had led to forms and consults, but nights gave her access to other texts. Medical journals with technical language, patient forums in the quiet hours, accounts of families who had tried everything. She read about living donor liver transplants in blunt patient voice, an explanation that, in rare cases, a healthy person can donate part of their liver to another person because the liver regenerates over time. It was plausible, clinical, and tightly hedged with complexity, matching, risk, recovery, and legal thresholds. She filed the words away like a splinter, small and suddenly accessible. She took to stealing moments in the hospital's waiting room, watchful, learning. She asked nurses harmless questions about the kinds of donors permitted. Policies, she learned, were strict. Hospitals were cautious, even defensive. There were well-documented reasons: the need to protect vulnerable donors, to avoid coercion, to regulate standards. For non-relatives, the road was sometimes closed. For a household like theirs, Carmen knew, rules could be both shield and shackle. She understood both sides. Her lost sister's image made her wary of systems that failed people. But her days with Laura filled her with a compulsion to act. One night, in the hush after Laura's fevers broke and the house breathed again, Carmen took a small risk. She asked the principal nurse for a routine blood test for herself, framing it to sound like curiosity, a general check because she had been feeling tired. The nurse smiled, the kind of smile that assumes people are where they belong. The vial of blood was labeled and sent. Carmen watched no more than the small, punctual machinery of lab work that night. She did not expect anything. The thought of being a match was something she held like a private ember. The results arrived weeks later, folded into the ordinary paperwork that Sebastião gave to his private physician. It was a pedestrian letter, her blood type, her immune markers. A clerk put the paper in a folder. A typo caught Carmen's eye as she passed the study room that evening. She saw the name of a test and, curious, read the numbers. They read like a secret. She was a match, perfect match, the lab code implied, an exceedingly rare alignment. The idea felt unreal in her chest, as if velocity and stillness had met. She sat down on a bench outside the nursery and let the dusk of a city that had no stake in her decision fold over her shoulders. There were 1,000 reasons to speak up, and 1,000 reasons to stay silent. There were legal barriers. There were bioethical walls designed to keep people safe. There was Sebastián's fear, which often presented itself as a stricter authority than any board of hospital administrators. When she told him, she did not dramatize. She had never been the sort to make speeches. In the kitchen, with the kettle clicking and Laura's drawings tacked against the refrigerator, Carmen placed the paper on the counter. Sebastián's hand hovered over it as if he were anticipating a mine. He read. His face, never particularly ripe with expression, asymmetrically shifted. Tightness around the mouth, a shudder somewhere behind his eyes. "You can't," he said. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a small wall setting up between them. It was the language of a man who loved with inventory and fear. "There is risk. You're not family. If you put your life at risk, I can't." "You don't have to decide for me," Carmen said. She folded her hands around the paper and felt its smallness. "I am not asking for permission." He looked at her then as if she had stepped out of a story he had not been assigned to read. He had always run the household in such a way that decisions bent towards safety. He had been a single father shaped by grief. He feared losing the child who had survived the birth he had failed to save her mother from. He had invested in certainty to escape an early, messy vulnerability. And now, Carmen's quiet assertion threatened the currency of that certainty. Doctors leaned toward protocol. The hospital, quiet example of institutional risk management, refused. Policy, they said, limited living donations to first-degree relatives unless exceptional approvals were granted. There were forms, committees, interviews. The word coercion came up, a clinical synonym for the kinds of heartbreaks institutions tried to prevent. A staff ethicist suggested independent counsel for the donor. The hospital was correct in its caution, and that caution felt to Carmen like a locked door when a child needed air. Sebastián's voice hardened in a way she had not heard before. "I will not have you put yourself in harm's way for my daughter. She is my responsibility. I will not let you make a decision that could ruin your life." His fear was not merely paternal. It was territorial, money as armor against the messy choices of the world. His identity had been fixed into the role of protector, even if that protection now sounded like veto. Carmen could have walked away. There were safer paths, and there were the invisible roads of discretion, where the heart learns to bend and live with regret. Instead, a memory from her childhood, her sister with a fever and no medicine, the locked clinic door, pressed on her like an ache. It sharpened choices. If the hospital would not allow it, she would find another way. She was painfully aware that this was not simply a medical decision. It would be a moral one. It would also be illegal in certain jurisdictions, ethically fraught in others, and tangled in the kind of moral quicksand the house she worked in had never been built to cross. Her research moved from pages to contacts. Dr. Morales was a name whispered on forums and in obscure medical write-ups. A transplant surgeon known for operating on pediatric cases that domestic centers refused. He worked out of a private clinic abroad, where the bureaucracy was different, where the pathway for non-relative donors had precedent. The paperwork there did not smell of vindication. It smelled of negotiation and the kind of clinical rigor Carmen could respect. She reached out under a false pretense. An email that suggested she had another patient to refer, a camouflage of professional distance. Dr. Morales replied with a bluntness that seemed genuine. "Send the tests," he said. "If a match is present, we can consider it." The decision to try was never cinematic. There were no dramatic, movie-style montages of passport stamps. There were nights of quiet packing, of choosing which clothes would not complain if left behind, of writing words you don't want to say and folding them into envelopes. Carmen wrote a letter and slipped it under Laura's pillow. It was not a manifesto. It was an offering in the simplest language she could find. A few sentences explaining choices and love. "If I don't wake," she wrote in short, steady lines, "know that I thought of you every minute. Protect her. Love her as I do." She folded it small and placed it where the child's hand might find it in the morning. No one saw her go. She packed in the silence that belongs to people who do not want to make their leaving a spectacle. She told Laura she was going to a distant friend's house, invented a family visit. To Sebastião, she offered logistics, a call when she arrived, proof of travel, assurances that she would return. Lies of omission slid out of necessity, not malice. They existed to preserve the child from alarm and the father from a decision he had not made and surely would have denied. At the airport, Carmen walked with the lightness of someone who had rehearsed an exit a dozen times. She carried only what could not be replaced: a small cross, the photo of Laura's mother she had kept from the first days of being hired, and the letter, now sealed in an envelope, folded into the inner pocket of her bag. As she passed through security, the bombardment of small noises, wheels, announcements, the distant laughter of strangers, felt like another world. She always had a strange sense of being two people at once: the woman who had left a childhood of scarcity behind, and the woman moving now toward a different kind of danger. Her phone was mostly off on the flight. She thought of the mattress she had once slept on in rooms that had too many mosquitoes and not enough sheets. She thought of her sister's face when she had begged someone to help. Those memories were not guilt, they were compasses. They pointed her toward this act with a clarity that felt both holy and human. On the plane, as the city shrank below a smear of lights, Carmen pressed a thumb over the envelope in her bag and felt the ridges of old paper under her skin. She rehearsed nothing. It was too heavy to rehearse. She knew the risks. She knew the statistics that glared like disclaimers in clinical articles. She knew she might not wake. She knew a hospital could say no at any moment. But somewhere along the line, the promise she had made to a small head upon her shoulder had thickened into a responsibility she could not walk away from. Back at the house, the rhythm faltered. Sebastião called in a string of messages that went unanswered. He paced through the corridor where Carmen's boots were no longer tucked near the pantry. Nurses checked in, finding only an explanation about errands and a note of apology tacked to a bulletin board. Laura slept with the letter still shy under her pillow, where a child's fingers might trace its edges in the morning and know only that someone had written something kind for her. Carmen did not travel alone, though the decision to leave felt singular. The option of doing this in secret did not mean she had to risk being reckless. Dr. Morales's team required tests, compatibility panels, imaging, psychiatric evaluations to ensure the donor's consent was informed. They asked questions Carmen had rehearsed for herself for years. She answered them honestly, about poverty, about a childhood of watching those who could not afford care die quietly, about what it would mean to risk a life for another's breath. The legalities overseas were not American copies, but they were lawful within the jurisdiction Dr. Morales practiced. There was oversight. There was clinical honesty in the pre-op data she received, percentages, precautions, expected recoveries. There were no guarantees. The surgeon's letter was formal, the tone clinical, and yet the signature at the bottom, Dr. Andres Morales, carried a steady confidence that was not hubris. He outlined that a living donor would give a portion of their liver. The liver is one of the rare organs in the human body that can regenerate. A partial donation allows the donor's tissue to regrow while the recipient's new portion begins functioning. That sentence was both a relief and a new anxiety, simple in its phrasing, profound in consequence. She slept in a sterile guest room near the clinic the night before the operation, and wrote a second, shorter note. This one she placed in her bag beside the photograph of Laura's mother. "Do not blame Sebastião," she wrote, then folded the paper small and sealed it with a quiet force. She thought of the father she had once seen holding Laura while the child vomited fever, of the man who had stayed by her bed for hours and then retreated behind the logic of professional advice. She thought of how much he loved Laura, and how fear had made him small in ways that had nothing to do with money. The clinic's corridors had an efficiency that Calder's machines would have envied: mechanical, purposeful, human staff who moved as if they were part of a machine with empathy fused into its gears. Nurses led Carmen to a pre-op room where she donned a simple gown and an IV was placed with clinical gentleness. A counselor came, asked whether she was certain. Carmen said she was. They asked whether her family knew. She said no, and the counselor made a note. There were forms to sign, the dry language of consent and risk. Carmen read them with the kind of attention a person gives when the page holds the outcome of more than their own future. Meanwhile, back in the city, Sebastião received a call from the clinic in the morning. The operator's voice spoke in measured tones, the kind that disguise urgency. Carmen had not returned the night before. She had flown overseas, the operator said. There were details, and there were quiet gaps where the operator might have explained or might have suggested comfort. The news felt like a blade and a relief all at once. He felt the ground of his control shift and then tilt. He called airports, drivers, the private physician who held the dossier on Laura like a brief. People moved to help him in the way money moves, efficiently, almost apologetically, as if they had not expected to have to do anything but open doors. He was told where she had traveled. The address swam like a foreign consonant. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked the phone, asking an absent person and the clerk who had no authority to answer a question of this size. He thought about stopping her. He thought about flying to meet her and saying no. He thought about how he had held the child and tested the edges of grief, and wondered if he had been wrong to try to banish risk from their lives. Before the flight had even touched foreign soil, Carmen lay in a preoperative bed and closed her eyes. There were sounds, a monitor that beeped in patient rhythm, a nurse murmuring facts, Dr. Morales's voice steadying the room. She thought of Laura's small hands and of her sister's face. She thought of the photograph of Laura's mother smiling from a shelf in a house that now held the hush of anticipated loss. She felt protean, a woman of many small selves layered like pages in a book. One of those selves put the letter she had written into the inner pocket of a coat on the chair beside her bed. If she did not wake, the letter would find a home. In the house, Sebastião sat in a chair and let the silence do what it does best. It built a space where he could think more quickly than he had ever allowed himself to before. He called a driver. He called his private physician. He arranged a passport. He was, in his way, mobilized by the news, and the mobilization had the sheen of someone who had never had to wait for trains. The house held its breath. Laura slept on, oblivious to the planes and the quick, sudden decisions that had been made to cross oceans. The balloons drooped slightly, and the cake seemed like an unshed promise. Nurses came and went with quiet forms and the kind of tenderness that could not be bought but was nonetheless given. There was a plaintive quality to the domestic ordinariness. The way a mug sat untouched on a counter. A library of children's books lined up with their spines bright. A small hand-drawn family portrait taped to the fridge. 2 women, a child, and a man with a tie. A picture that seemed to predict the possibility of a chosen family rather than a family constrained by blood. At the airport where Carmen waited to be transferred to the operative theater, she saw a small child running between the legs of adults. The child was laughing, oblivious to the scene of grown-up decisions playing out not far away. The image hit her, momentary and sharp. It reminded her why she had closed the door behind her, why she had carried that small photograph and that letter like the only currency that mattered. She wanted Laura to have more mornings like the child's laughter she had just seen. Then the team that had prepared her began the rituals that hospitals are built on. Final checks, confirmations, the soft wash of antiseptic, and the bubbling calm of anesthetic explained in a voice that sought to comfort with fact. A surgeon's hand brushed her shoulder. Dr. Morales spoke her name and explained the timing once more. Carmen nodded. She felt neither bravado nor heroism. She felt a simplicity, like a stone that lands where it must. On the flight that took Sebastião halfway across the globe, he watched a city of his own shrink toward a small map on his phone. He felt a tightness in his throat that was new, not only grief, but the sudden arrival of humility. He had opposed Carmen, had framed her concern as imprudence. He had objected in the language of a man who believed he knew how to keep his child safe. Now, as he flew, he thought of everything he had not known about fear, about the way people make brave choices for reasons you cannot measure on a ledger. The plane's engines hummed like a muted clock. He thought of the times he had tried to control outcomes with contracts and contacts, and he felt something corrode in him. Not guilt exactly, but a recognition that protection sometimes requires trust in others' love. He thought of the photograph on the mantel, of the child who had asked to blow out candles. He promised himself in a private voice that he would be ready to forgive. He had not anticipated the depth of the gratitude that would arrive if Carmen returned safe. He had not anticipated the tears he might shed if he read what she had written. By the time the sky grew pale with a foreign dawn, Carmen had been led into the operating suite. In one room, the machine lights were clinical and cool. In another, they were warmed by a nurse's hand that squeezed a parent's shoulder. Cameras of experience recorded every routine movement. The team worked with the kind of choreography that erases the panic of moments into practiced sections. Carmen inhaled the anesthetic and felt the world yield into the blankness that makes decision possible and terrifying all at once. Back home, the first of many messages flashed across a screen. "Operation underway," one nurse wrote, and the note trembled with the ordinary courage of people who live with other people's risks. Sebastião's eyes filled as the plane descended. He felt a strange, fissured gratitude for the woman he had once tried to block. It was an emotion that would catch him by surprise later, when he read a paper, when he saw a photograph, when he opened the sealed envelope that would change the house and its quiet ways forever. The waiting rooms of surgeries occupy a peculiar moral geography. Time dilates. People move in and out with news, with small textiles like scarves that are passed for warmth. Nurses offer coffee and ambiguous reassurances. After the induction, there was a lull. The machine clocks seemed louder. In a small, prearranged time, a doctor would emerge and say things that were either heavy or hopeful. For now, there were small rituals: a prick of meth, a sip of water, the final call of a name. Carmen slept in the way people sleep before a river crossing, full of trust and fear that are somehow the same thing. On a table in the nurse's station, an envelope awaited with her name, with a letter that would travel where she might not be able to. It sat like evidence and prayer. Sebastião left the airport with a driver who did not ask many questions. He went straight to the hospital and sat down in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and the faint ghost of perfume. He did not know how long he sat. He read small medical pamphlets with an attention that made their words into anchors. He watched the clock hand move without being able to influence its speed. When the surgeon finally emerged, he carried his confidence like a worn coat, practical, less theatrical than the man's hands suggested. He answered questions with the flat steadiness of someone who had done this many times. It was successful, the surgeon said, the tones of the words balanced with the careful hedging of medical reality. Both patient and donor are stable. We will need to monitor closely. There are risks attached: rejection, infection, complications. We are cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic. Those three words are the medical world's attempt at tenderness. They are not dramatic enough for the headline pages, but they are honest. They do not promise miracles. They promise a possibility that must be guarded and cultivated. Sebastião felt a flood of something he had not allowed himself to name: gratitude that bent under the weight of other feelings. He was prepared to be angry. He had rehearsed scenes of confrontation. He had not prepared himself to stand in a hospital corridor and cry. Tears came without permission. They were not theatrical, they were private absolutions leaking from a man who had been taught that tears were for private closets, not public rooms. He found the envelope by accident. No, not an accident. A nurse handed him a small package found in Carmen's bag, a sealed letter with blunt handwriting. He thought for a flicker that the letter might contain legal paperwork, directions. Instead, the paper inside was a prayer and a confession. Carmen's words were short, direct, tender. "If I don't wake," she had written, "you must love her. Know that I chose this for her." The letter did what words do best. It moved the heart to an immediate understanding of the kind of person who would make such a choice. Sebastião folded into a chair and let tears fall where his hands had once been busy with deals and deadlines. He cried for the child who lay in another room, for the woman who lay vulnerably in an operating suite, for the thinness of control that had always been the foundation of his life. The tears were old grief and new relief, gratitude and shame braided together in a single response. They made him small and real in a way money never could. Outside the operating theater, the city breathed on. People walked without knowledge of the human architecture inside the hospital. The lull lasted a few hours, and then the first tentative updates began. Stable vitals, no immediate complications, the slow exhale of teams that have practiced for moments like this. There would be more to come. The early hours are always the quietest, the time when the outcome is still a question rather than a story. But in the waiting room, wrapped around a paper cup of cooling coffee, Sebastião sat with a new humility. He thought of the balloons, the cake, the small hands. He imagined Carmen's sister and the possibility of a life prolonged. He imagined Laura waking and opening a letter under her pillow and the subsequent complicated gratitude they would owe, gratitude sandaled by guilt and softened by a kind of unspeakable debt that money cannot repay. For now, he could only wait and hold the envelope in his fingers as if it were a small relic. He promised himself he would be different afterward. He could almost hear the house's rooms shift in anticipation, the air waiting to be reshaped by choices that would not be made only by him. When the first call came to announce the end of the surgeries, a nurse's voice was careful. Both operations had been concluded. Both patient and donor were stable in the immediate post-operative period, breathing with assistive machines. There would be complications to watch for. There would be conversations to have about long-term risk, about recovery timelines, about the careful negotiation of hope and prudence. "It's not a cure," the voice on the phone said, softly enough to be honest and kind. "It's a chance." A chance is enough to tilt a life. A chance is not assurance, but it is a portal. It requires tending and humility and the acceptance that outcomes are never owed to those who hope. Sebastião folded the nurse's words into the cavity he had made for himself, and in that silence read Carmen's letter again, aloud, in the empty corridor. "If I don't wake, know I said yes," he whispered, and his voice cracked in a way that was not performative but utterly human. The tears came harder this time, not only for the present, but for a future shaped by a quiet woman who had stepped into danger for another's breath. Outside, a winter light slid through the hospital's high windows. The house across the ocean was a handful of hours away from the first steps of convalescence. The balloon that Laura had chosen trembled in memory. Somewhere in that city, devices track tremors and vitals and the slow, patient work of healing. For a few hours, the world had narrowed down to beeps and breath and a folded piece of paper that changed hands and hearts. Carmen rested under the sweep of bright, sterile lights. Machines hummed as if reciting prayers in a language clinicians understood. A nurse adjusted her blankets, and Dr. Morales made notes at a computer. Outside, in a small, foreign room, a father who had once tried to control outcomes now learned what it meant to let go. There would be a long conversation to follow about ethics, about policies, about the risks of non-relative donation. There would be television vans and newspaper calls and legal questions that sprouted like mushrooms after rain. There would be the complicated fame that persons who perform public acts of private love sometimes face. There would be public debate about rules, consent, and the boundaries of institutional caution. But for the moment, the house that had once been a place of precise, ordered protection held a new, trembling possibility. In the nursery, a child slept with a letter hidden under her pillow, a soft relic of the world she could not yet imagine. Words that might wake her into a life shaped by the courage of a woman who was not her mother, but had become, in every action that mattered, the person who would stand by her. If you love stories like this, subscribe for more. The plane wheels clicked on foreign tarmac. Nurses read charts. A man in a waiting room cried for reasons that blurred pride and regret. The night stretched, and between the ticking of distant clocks, a choice had been made that would not make the coming days easy, but it would make them different. The small photograph of a smiling woman on a shelf and the envelope with its few abrupt sentences had already begun to change the geometry of family in a house built on loss. The rest of the story would require patience, care, and the hard work of families remade. The first days after operation moved like a prayer set in pieces. Nurses checked lines and records, turned faces for comfort, whispered to machines. Carmen lay with a thin film of sweat on her upper lip, an inscrutable mix of exhaustion and relief slackening across features that had never been built for headlines. Her breathing found rhythm on its own, then with the help of medications, then with the careful guidance of therapists. Her scars were neat and pale. Her voice, when it returned, was surprised at how small it sounded after the long, mechanical quiet of anesthetic. Laura's recovery room, by contrast, filled with small noises that belonged to childhood. A sock being tugged on, a stuffed animal rearranged, someone humming an off-key tune from a cartoon. The new liver, the surgeons told them, had begun working immediately, functioning enough to clear certain toxins and to permit the team to restart therapies that had previously failed to register on the tumor's radar. That sentence, "we can try again," is the kind of sentence clinicians use when they mean caution and hope braided together. They warned that nothing was settled, that cancer is stubborn, and that responses are varied. Still, tests taken a week after the transplant showed shrinkage in unexpected places. Radiologists circled images and noted the change with a quiet incredulity. "Uncommon," one oncologist said softly in a conversation that included Sebastião and the hospital's pediatric team on a video call. He did not use the word miracle. He could not. Instead, he said words like response, regression, and statistical anomaly, phrases meant to anchor hope in the language of measurement. The effect on the people in that video call, however, was not statistical at all. It landed like sunlight through a crack. Sebastião sat with the monitor glow reflected on his face and felt something thaw. He had known grief. He had been made small by it, stubborn in his attempts to control. Now, in a corridor halfway around the world and a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and coffee, the man who paid for solutions let himself be reformed by gratitude. He spent hours in the small anteroom, reading medical notes until the ink blurred into prayer. He visited Carmen in recovery, pressed his hand to that of the woman who had once been merely an employee and now threaded through every plan for tomorrow. "What you did," he said once in a voice that had lost its armor, "I can't repay." Carmen said what she had always said in quiet forms. Take care of her. No rhetoric, no claims, just a direction that summed the moral of every small steady thing she had done for years. He wept again then, tears that, when they came, felt like the last of a storm. The hospital's first press statement was short and clinical. It confirmed 2 surgeries, listed the immediate post-operative status as stable, and urged respect for patient privacy. That attempt at quiet did not hold. Someone within the hospital, or someone with access to the family, leaked enough details that, within 48 hours, a cluster of reporters descended on the house where the story began. Headlines spread not just because of the drama, but because the case folded into several provocative angles. A wealthy father, a nanny who was a donor, the legal gaps around non-relative living donation. Cameras found the house. Journalists assembled on the sidewalk with carefully framed banners. Social media erupted with versions of praise and critique, calls for investigations, and emotional expressions from people who had never met Laura or Carmen but who felt the tug of the story. A hospital ethics committee issued a statement that they were cooperating with inquiries. Health authorities confirmed they were monitoring the case. In the weeks that followed, regulators asked questions about consent processes, about the chain of custody for test results, and about the boundaries institutions set to protect donors. Critics argued that the system's rigidity had forced a woman to seek care elsewhere. Defenders argued the rules were meant to prevent coercion and exploitation. The conversation spilled into op-eds and television panels, where doctors discussed the necessity of safeguards, and where ethicists reminded viewers that compassion and protocol are not always easy companions. Those larger debates mattered, but within the rooms where the family gathered, the concerns were human and immediate. Reporters crowded a driveway, cameras angled for a reaction shot when Sebastião briefly stepped outside. He waved them off, sometimes with a terse statement, more often with nothing at all. He learned to plead, privately and publicly, for discretion. "This is my daughter," he said once to a microphone, and then turned away before he could give a long answer. He did not want the story to become louder than the child's breathing. Offers came to Carmen, some generous, some performative. Foundations proposed prizes. Television shows wanted to dramatize the events. A handful of politicians reached out, eager to align themselves with a story that raised questions about health policy and human compassion. Friends of the family urged caution. Publicity could harm Laura's recovery, they said. Media attention often abrades fragile hope. Carmen, however, did not see herself as public property. She had no interest in trophies. She wanted two things: for Laura to get well, and for the chaos of inquiry to spare the child the bright glare of narrative. "So much noise," she told Dr. Morales once, with a simplicity that cut through his attempts to compliment her courage. "Let the child sleep." Dr. Morales, who had seen both the clinical and the human sides of similar cases, arranged for an interview to be given to a major medical journal that would focus on technical safeguards and informed consent rather than sensationalism. It was the kind of quiet stewardship Carmen appreciated. Facts framed by her wishes for privacy. Sebastião, learning from his own transformation, became fiercely protective of that arrangement. He refused offers that would feature Carmen. He turned away cameras that insisted on grilling the family in the driveway. He hired a small team to manage communications with a single rule: no interview with the child while she is still convalescing. Inside the household, the dynamics shifted in ways both subtle and seismic. Nurses came and went with updated medication schedules. Therapists brought playful exercises to rebuild stamina. Laura, still fragile but bright in a way that belongs only to children, received visitors on a controlled basis. Close family, one friend at a time, a pediatric psychologist who made a habit of asking what silly thing she wanted to do that day. She asked for a blanket with stars, for a book with animals that rescue each other. Her appetite returned in fits and starts. There were small victories: a day when she could walk to the window and count taxis again, a night without fever. Carmen's recovery also required care. Living donors do not always appear in the stories. Their convalescence is quieter, threaded into someone else's celebration. Carmen learned to ask for help. A physical therapist showed her how to sit without tugging at stitches. A nurse taught her breathing exercises to clear the scarred airways from a night of general anesthesia. The home staff rotated to help her with meals and rest. Sebastião, who had once believed love could be purchased in the right clinics and consultants, learned something that money could not buy: how to make his house a place of care rather than command. He left notes by Carmen's bedside with the clumsy tenderness of someone trying to be useful. A cup placed within easy reach, a playlist of soft music he thought she would like, a small bouquet he refused to let anyone else carry in. It was in a quiet afternoon, a slow Tuesday, that the scans returned words the team had not expected. The lead oncologist brought the imaging and sat down, the gravity of her manner now shaded by a smile that had fought its way past clinical restraint. "We saw regression in multiple areas," she said, and then paused as if to let the meaning settle into the room. "We are carefully optimistic. We will keep monitoring, but this is promising." They did not celebrate with champagne. People who had lived close to death for months know the economy of restraint. Instead, there was a soft chorus: smiles, hands reaching, a small awkward applause from a nurse who had watched both women rise from worse places. Laura, told the news in language a child could hold, clapped, and asked if she could have an extra piece of cake for luck. Carmen pressed a hand to her chest and felt the edges of the fear that had once been lodged there begin to unravel. The day Carmen left the clinic, they sent her home with a folder of post-operative instructions and a small, unassuming badge from the staff: "Living donor, recovering." The badge read like an anthem for quiet heroism. Journalists tried to intercept her at the airport, but the family's communications team had arranged a private transfer. When she entered the house again weeks later, there was a cluster of balloons, Laura's doing, of course, and a quiet assembly of faces that had shifted shape in her absence. Sebastião waited at the doorway, chin damp with sleep, eyes rimmed with the fatigue of endurance. He did not reach for boardrooms or contracts. He took Carmen's hands and held them as if the act of holding could make everything right. "You changed us," he said simply. "You changed me." She offered a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I just wanted her to have mornings," she said. The simplicity of that sentence carried all the moral complexity of her choice. The media spectacle ebbed and flowed. There were op-eds that praised Carmen's bravery and recommendations for legal review. There were cautionary pieces that warned against letting emotion erode safeguards designed to protect donors from harm. Several hospital networks issued internal reviews of their living donor policies, with statements noting that each case needed rigorous evaluation and that institutions must be careful to balance compassion and protection. Some health authorities opened formal inquiries into whether rules should allow more flexibility for non-relative donations under strict oversight. Others urged skepticism, reminding the public of historical abuses that safeguards were designed to prevent. Public institutions moved slowly, their wheels grinding in the same bureaucratic patterns that had prompted Carmen to look elsewhere in the first place. The conversation prompted legislative aides to draft bills requiring clearer pathways for exceptional cases, with mandatory psychological evaluations and independent advocacy for donors. Committees scheduled hearings. The result was not a simple, immediate policy rewrite, but an opening of dialogue. Experts convened panels, ethicists wrote papers, some jurisdictions revised guidance to include clearer criteria for non-relative donation under strict oversight. The details varied, and on some fronts remained indeterminate, questions pending as inquiries took their time. None of it, Carmen observed, changed the days when Laura still needed to nap in the afternoons. There were personal consequences as well. People in Carmen's old neighborhood wrote letters. A woman who had once worked with small children and now ran a community clinic sent a handmade quilt with a note, "So you never forget where you started." Carmen read those letters quietly and placed them in a small drawer near the photo of Laura's mother. The public offers, awards, scholarships, and invitations to speak arrived packaged in glossy envelopes. She accepted one private invitation from a small nonprofit that helped families with pediatric cancer navigate care. She declined the televised appearances and the overtures that would turn her into an emblem. Sebastião managed the balance of gratitude and privacy in a new way. He spoke fewer times in public, and when he did, his language had softened. He started a foundation, small, strictly private at first, to support families needing cross-border medical care, emphasizing transparency and independent oversight. The foundation employed ethics advisors and legal counsel to ensure it did not repeat the ambiguous spaces Carmen had to navigate. His public statements emphasized a single, repeating theme. Policy matters, yes, but the dignity and wishes of patients and donors must guide decisions. Inside the home, the small rituals of life reasserted themselves. Laura returned to school part-time as she gained strength. She made friends who hardly understood the gravity she had carried. She had for a while a fascination with maps, places Carmen had flown, and the clinic city, a distant red dot now stamped with real meaning. Teachers learned that she sometimes needed a nap and sometimes asked to check the number of taxis as an exercise in counting. They gave her stickers to mark her progress. She insisted on birthday traditions that were modest and bright. At 7, she blew out candles with a concentration that made everyone in the room hold their breath. Carmen kept the framed photo of Laura's mother on a small shelf in her room. She added to it over time. A child's drawing of 2 women and a man, a note from Laura that read, "For Mama #2, folded into an envelope with childish care. She refused, always, the pronoun that would give her a public title beyond the private one. But in softer corners of the internet and in the house itself, people began to call her Mama Number 2, a moniker offered with affection rather than legal claim. She took it like she took the small gifts people sent, with humility. As the months passed and scans continued to show favorable trends, the family allowed themselves a kind of careful planning. They arranged a modest celebration for Laura's first birthday after the transplant. Friends and a few relatives gathered in the garden, the light warm and forgiving. The cake was small, with blue frosting, just as Laura had wanted. The photograph of her mother was placed on a corner table. The letter Carmen had left under the pillow that had traveled to a foreign hospital now sat in a small frame, folded and annotated with the date of Carmen's surgery. They read the words together, short, tender, then placed the letter in the living room, where it remained a silent covenant. Sebastião, who had once believed that protection meant control, made a small ritual of giving thanks, privately. He had found in the shock of his tears and the humility of gratitude a recalibrated version of fatherhood. He read to Laura sometimes, not always the technical manuals that once lined his shelves, but picture books about ordinary bravery. He learned to braid hair, badly. He learned to leave medicine reminders on the kitchen counter and not ask 20 questions. His presence became steadier, less theatrical, more attuned. He stopped asking who to call for everything, and listened instead for the small urgings of people who were there every day. 5 years later, the house retained traces of the old order, expensive furniture, framed art, but it bore new habits. License plates from cities they'd visited hung by the entryway. Laura, now a tall 12-year-old with an appetite for science and a relentless curiosity about hospitals, declared she would become a pediatrician or an adoption lawyer, professions she said would allow her to fix things for other kids. She did not romanticize the past. She had been honest about the nights she had cried from pain and the afternoons when she felt small and scared. But she also had a stubborn optimism that had gotten her through. She led a school project on organ donation awareness for teens, with Carmen and Sebastião in the audience. Carmen taught her to fold letters neatly and mail them. Sebastião helped draft grant proposals for the foundation. The family, now less a constellation of lines than a shape chosen by daily acts, kept the framed letter on a living room shelf where anyone could see it. Its envelope, once sealed in a hospital drawer, had been opened and read many times and preserved under glass, the ink a little faded at the creases. The photograph of Laura's mother had a new frame, gifted by a neighbor who had watched the family evolve. On some afternoons, the three of them would sit together, the air thick with ordinary talk. School assignments, dinner plans, a debate about which movie to watch, and the letter would sit there as a quiet anchor. Sebastião still carried the ache of his wife's absence, and sometimes the old grief would arrive like a late-season storm. But it had changed shape. Now it included gratitude for small human decisions made in rooms far from headlines. He visited the clinic overseas once to thank Dr. Morales in person and to meet the staff who had cared for Carmen. He offered to fund research into donor safety and family counseling protocols. He supported policy conversations that balanced individual autonomy with institutional care. He had learned, painfully, that money could open doors but not dictate their moral architecture. Carmen, for her part, continued to resist the spotlight. She kept working with children, sometimes in the same house, sometimes as part of small clinics that served neighborhoods like the one she had come from. She took on a mentorship role for young women in her old district who needed support navigating work and health resources. The public offers ceased to batter her privacy after she politely turned them down. The world tended to move on when it did not find what it sought. The nonprofit she sometimes met with framed her as an advisor, not a face in a campaign. That suited her. She liked the quiet of making choices that mattered without an audience. At a public meeting on health policy some years later, a lawmaker mentioned the case as an example of why systems should have carefully designed exceptions and transparent safeguards. Carmen did not attend the meeting. Instead, she stood at a small community center and taught a class to mothers about consent forms and how to ask questions when someone recommends a risky procedure. She told them, plainly and without moralizing, that systems were imperfect and that people have to know their rights and their options. Her talk was practical, not ideological. She gave out her phone number to a few women who needed help navigating appointments. She did not ask for gratitude. She did not want it. Laura, at 12, volunteered at the clinic once a month, folding charts and handing out stickers. The work was small and significant. Something she said helped her understand that medical systems are made of people as well as rules. She wrote, in an essay for school, about a promise that had been kept and a life that had been extended. Her teachers praised the maturity of her rating and asked if she would allow the essay in the school newsletter. She shook her head and instead read the piece aloud at a small assembly. Afterward, she hugged Carmen and said, "Thank you for choosing me." Carmen's answer was the same as it had been in the hospital corridor, a shrug and a small smile. "You made it easy to choose," she said. On a late Sunday afternoon, when the light came through the living room at just the right angle, the family sat together and looked at the framed letter. The house smelled of baking bread, Sebastián's attempt to follow a recipe he had found on a parenting blog, and the sound of a distant television vibrated softly. Laura placed a small bouquet of wildflowers in front of the frame, with the solemnity of a small ritual. She had insisted on growing the flowers herself that spring, watching them make a kind of stubborn color by the window. "You cried a lot," she teased her father gently, remembering the hospital corridor. "You cried like you were happy and sad at the same time." Sebastián let out a breathy laugh and nodded. "I did. I still do when I think about it." They sat in a domestic hush, the kind that has nothing to do with drama and everything to do with peace. The letter, the photograph, the mended bodies, they were artifacts of choices made in urgency, of a system that sometimes fails, and of people who sometimes make the small rebellions that matter most. The sunlight moved across the framed words until the letters glowed faintly. At the center of that image was a truth the house had learned. Family is sometimes the sum of love that chooses to stay. Legal bonds and genetic lines can mean a great deal, but chosen attachments, small, steady, sacrificial, reconfigure the geometry of a life. Carmen never wanted to be lauded as a hero. She wanted mornings for a child she loved. Sebastián, once the man who thought each problem had a price, learned that certain debts cannot be repaid, and instead offered a different currency: steady presence. Years later, when Laura applied to volunteer at the same clinic where she had received care, she wrote a brief letter explaining why. "I want to help kids know they are not alone," she wrote. "I want to be the person who sits with them when the world is loud." Her letter arrived with a short note from Carmen taped to the back. "Make sure you take breaks." It was maternal in the way of people who have learned how to care without losing themselves. They did not rehearse their final tableau. It arrived quietly one Sunday afternoon, a photograph taken by a neighbor as the three of them walked along a park path. Sebastián in a navy jacket, Carmen with a scarf, Laura skipping slightly ahead. The picture captured the small, worn familiarity of a family that had been remade. It was not perfect. There were shadows in the image, old losses, the memory of a woman who would never be there for a birthday. But the picture held a sturdier light than any headline. They framed that photograph and placed it near the living room mantel, the framed letter beside it. The story that began with a prognosis and a choice did not end with tidy lessons. It remained, instead, a cluster of human decisions. A woman who would not accept the limits of a system learned to find a lawful, careful way to act. A father who had used money to shield himself from pain learned to live inside vulnerability. A child who had once thought time a finite bank learned to measure mornings anew. Policy scholars wrote articles, regulators revised guidance, but the true change was quieter. Literal mornings, meals shared, a child who turned into a teenager with ambitions for a future she barely dared imagine when she was 6. In a quiet coda, years after the surgeries, a small plaque appeared on a bench in the park where they had taken the photograph. It did not bear grand language. It read simply, "For mornings." The plaque was placed by a neighbor, a modest gift that encapsulated a truth the family carried. What people do for one another in the small hours matters more than any headline. They had given the story this life for a reason, to honor a decision made in private that had public consequences. The world argued over institutions and rules, as it must, but in a living room warmed by late sun, a framed letter and a photograph told the story without arrogance. The nanny's secret had, in the end, changed the shape of a home. It had turned a man who once defined himself by control into someone who could bow to love and weep. It had taught a child the contour of chosen family. It had begun debates that would reverberate in committee rooms and academic conferences, and those debates were important. And yet, the most enduring image was intimate and small. A 6-year-old blowing out a candle, a woman's folded note under a pillow, A father pressing his face into his hands in a hospital corridor until he sobbed. Those moments were not spectacle. They were human transactions of care and courage. They made a millionaire father cry, not because he had lost money, but because he had gained a truth his wealth could never have purchased, that some risks are worth taking when they are chosen out of love. If this moved you, like and share this story, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments.